Hi, and welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Before we get started, we just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is produced by the CATA Project, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. Funding for this project comes from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. This is going to sound obvious to those of you who can hear me, but please remember to turn your speakers on. That's what you'll need to hear the presentation. So hopefully those who can't hear will see this photo and know to turn their speakers on. Please note that there are two features to ask questions during the webinar. You can use the Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you might have regarding content. We will begin with questions that have been emailed in prior to the live session. If your question isn't answered right away, please wait until the end of the presentation. You may also ask questions anonymously by checking the anonymous box on the Q&A feature. The chat panel is where you can ask tech support questions, and we will answer those questions immediately in the chat panel. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Andrea Diaz. She is the Training and Prevention Manager at MISSSEY Incorporated. Andrea advocates and supports youth through education. She loves being in the community and working toward creating safer spaces for youth to navigate by offering outreach, information, and collaboration. Andrea is a certified domestic violence counselor and has served as a case manager, San Francisco Police Department liaison, and education manager in that field. She is passionate about working with women and youth and learning how to best build support for and around them. So if you will give us 1 second, we're going to switch controls over and then she will begin.
So good morning. My name is Andrea. I work for MISSSEY as a Training Institute Manager. At MISSSEY, we work on supporting and serving sexually exploited youth. We have been around for over a decade. Founded by 4 women, 2 of which were survivors, and that has really guided the work we do from inception. So we really focus on making sure that the voice of the youth we serve is constantly heard and is constantly informing how and what we do. We provide services as well as work for systemic change. We definitely know that they go hand in hand to actually make an impact for the young people we serve. We do case management, we have a drop-in center, we have engagement specialists stationed at the assessment center in Alameda County. We also support youth in an employment program and making sure that if they are looking to make change, it's sustainable change. Money is definitely a need for anyone, so we want to make sure that they are having the resources and tools to be able to sustain themselves if they choose to leave the life. We have the Training Institute, which I am really excited to be a part of. Advocating and educating people is really important to making sure that the young people aren't being re-traumatized when they're coming in touch with other people. We also advocate for policy and legislation change, community outreach, just making sure people know we are here and how to reach us, and then prevention. So I get to go out to a lot of schools and community centers and work with young people to hopefully give them some tools to prevent it, or at least the tools to know that there are resources out there to support them. So today we're going to really focus on the pathways and recruitment, as well as talk a little bit about how to support young people that are being exploited. But I'm just going to do a brief overview of some definitions, just so we all kind of have a base knowledge and we have some common vocabulary as we work through the slides. When we speak to CSEC, I'm talking about the commercial sexual exploitation of children and youth. We serve youth up to age 24. We know that 18 out in the world is this magic number that all of a sudden you become responsible and are held accountable for everything. But we know that young people don't turn 18 and then magically have all the answers and are able to just create and, kind of follow through with all the change that they want. So we do serve young people up until age 24. And when I speak to CSEC, I'm not only talking about children, I am also talking about youth, including that transitional age youth. We know that commercial sex, that the commercial sexual exploitation of children is a form of a human rights violation, and that it also falls within the spectrum of sexual abuse and violence against children. We're also not just speaking about street prostitution when we're talking about CSEC, we're talking about stripping, pornography, webcam sessions, survival sex, as well as internet and social media exploitation. So using tools like Snapchat Premium or nude massages, all those things also come into play when we're talking about the exploitation of children and youth. Force, fraud, fear, and coercion are generally the tools used, and we know that with anybody under the age of 18, that does not have to be proven to be classified as human trafficking. We know that young people under 18 cannot give consent. So automatically, anytime somebody is engaging in any type of sexual activity with somebody under the age of 18 for an exchange, again, it doesn't have to be money, it could be food, it could be shelter, it could be clothing. We are looking at human trafficking and more specifically at CSEC. So as I spoke earlier, we always want to make sure that we are keeping the knowledge that CSEC falls under the continuum of sexual abuse. While all sexual abuse is not CSEC, all CSEC is sexual abuse. And it's really important to frame it in that way. So when we are talking about young people, or we're working with young people who are being exploited, we remember that they are facing abuse repeatedly. Night after night, right? And multiple times, and kind of keeping that in context when we are working with young people and that impact that that's going to have on a young person. So overall, at the time, the human trafficking movement is gaining momentum, much like sexual assault in the 80s and domestic violence in the 80s. People are starting to, shift the lens. So starting to, we're seeing system and legislation, policies and responses that are changing and coming out. Again, we are seeing that in 2000, countries came together and finally acknowledged that human trafficking is a human rights violation. We are now also being able to kind of track of its worldwide impact. We know it's a $150 billion industry and continues to grow. It's the fastest growing criminal enterprise at the time and is pretty much on par with drugs. So it's a huge impact. It's really comes together and impacts through a lot of different systems. So while we know that human trafficking and sexual exploitation can happen to anybody, it's really important that we do address that there are definitely certain inequities that exist that impact specific groups. So again, it can occur to anybody, but we know that it's more likely to occur to girls, and particularly girls of color. With Black girls being the ones that are most greatly impacted. And we know that all the intersections of oppression are really going to make a big impact as to not only who is affected, but then also how those young people feel that they are able to access resource and support. So it's really important that we keep that in mind as we're working with young people, and we don't undervalue that there are certain communities that are facing a greater impact by commercial sexual exploitation. So grooming and pathways. So a lot of people definitely always have questions of how this comes about. And I think one of the biggest things to remember is that there are a lot of different risk factors. And while all these can exist for somebody and them not find themselves exploited, or where only one of these can exist and exploitation can happen, is that it's really going to vary from individual to individual. But the biggest risk factor that we see with young people is age. Just being a young person makes somebody really vulnerable. So we know that most young people enter exploitation between ages 12 to 14, with boys starting between 11 to 13, and youth in the LGBTQ plus community coming in between 15 to 17. But that being under 18 really creates a lot of vulnerabilities, from being dependent on somebody, right? Somebody who's under 18 can't go out and just secure work and provide for themselves. They can't go out and apply for an apartment and have somewhere to live. They are just by law dependent on somebody else, and that dependency creates vulnerability. Also, having an experience of earlier childhood sexual abuse. Over 90% of young people who are exploited have been abused prior. Again, when we look back at that continuum of abuse, we see that, you know, that earlier abuse kind of creates that normalcy for youth to continue to be abused and then be exploited. System involvement, so child welfare, juvenile system, you know, something that we hear from our young people is that sometimes these systems can almost feel like a training ground. And while there are definitely a lot of positive individuals out there that work within these systems and can be positive role models and support systems for young people, there's also, you know, unfortunately times when that's not individuals' experience. So in, for example, the child welfare system, you know, young people are often moved around. There is a money exchange that is happening for them to be cared for. And that is almost a mirror to what trafficking looks like, right? It's getting moved around, having to go from place to place, there being a money exchange for something. So young people can sometimes see that mirror. And again, it just makes it feel normal. So things like poverty, housing instability, food insecurity, and that's really one of the big drivers, particularly for that survival sex exploitation. So if you don't have somewhere to stay or you need something to eat, you know, it really can creates this need for young people. Exposure to violence, both home, community, and society. And I think it's really important that we remember that we do live in a society where violence is very common ground, right? From TV to the news, you know, just learning about what impact our government is having in our country or in other countries, or watching a movie or listening to music. Violence is very normalized, and it's a constant message that we are receiving. So it doesn't only have to happen at home. It doesn't have to be that we are in a community. Really, our whole world really normalizes violence for us. Being a person of color, again, that's one of the top risk factors for young people, and then being part of the LGBTQ plus community. So again, we see young people who are part of the community coming into exploitation at an older age, and it's usually in correlation with maybe coming into their truth, coming out and not being accepted by family members, or their communities no longer being safe as they are, you know, identifying as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And so then having to go out, and we also know that the LGBTQ plus community is the one that most highly engages in survival sex. So other risk factors are just also those pieces that come with being young and being in that transition age. So things like feeling insecure, being used to being told what to do by adults, the desire for love and romance, and also kind of the beginnings of that, and not always having maybe healthy examples or healthy ways to ask questions and communicate about those desires. The want for consumer goods, wanting more independence, and wanting to test boundaries and take risks, which I think most people can kind of, if you want to reflect a little bit back to being young, those are really natural feelings and wants that come up for young people. So when we take all these risk factors and all these things, all these pieces that can kind of, you know, put young people at risk, and then we put them into this pathway of entry, we can see how it happens. So generally, it starts with grooming. So most exploitation is not the Hollywood version of, you know, somebody just getting kidnapped off the street. Usually exploitation happens after a relationship has been established, or with somebody who already has an existing relationship. So it's gaining trust, It's developing love and fulfilling unmet needs. Those unmet needs are really a big piece that make young people vulnerable, right? And so somebody comes in, sees what that young person is missing or what that young person needs, and they really start filling in those gaps, right? So doing things like love bombing. If you are not familiar with that term, love bombing is really just giving somebody so much love and so much affection and so much attention that they are just, having this huge release of endorphins and just getting this really big high from all the love they're getting. And again, this is really natural response, right? This is just the way that our bodies respond to feeling good, to feeling loved. So you get this kind of chemical high. And then what happens during that process, that person will then just take all that love away. They'll just stop it. So I like to think of it as putting somebody up on a really high pedestal and then just kicking that pedestal out right from underneath them. And that creates a multitude of things, right? That's from the emotional and mental piece of like, oh no, what happened, what's wrong? But then also from the physiological piece of no longer having that kind of natural high and that natural endorphin release. And then that person will come back again and love bomb again. So build them up, kick the pedestal out. So it creates this roller coaster effect and can create a lot of instability for young people internally, both again, emotionally and physiologically. So that's a really big way that you start that kind of grooming process. As well as, just developing a relationship, right? It's not usually youth that once they're exploited, it isn't after this relationship has been established. And this person starts feeling dependent and loving and caring towards the exploiter. From there, we move on over to recruitment. So that's where that exploiter will start over involving in that young person's life. So it can be, demanding to know where they're going, not allowing them maybe to have the same interaction with friends and family members, starting to isolate that young person. And again, all these things don't always show up in an aggressive or violent way, right? Sometimes they can be seen or presented as a good opportunity. So maybe the exploiter isolates the young person by saying, hey, I have a great opportunity 2 states away, you should come with me. It's a chance for us to start new. I really care about you. This is a really good opportunity for both of us. And we can go and, really have a better life together over there. So then, maybe that young person agrees. Now they're 2 states away with an exploiter. And now they're being asked to engage in activities that maybe they wouldn't have if they still had their support system. Manipulation. So, getting a young person to do something, whether it's by saying like, hey, if you loved me, you would do this, or I really need this money, or you owe it to me. I've been helping you out this whole time. You only have to do it once. It can also be manipulating through blackmail. So maybe the young person shared videos or they videotape them doing something that young person wouldn't feel comfortable having shown, and they're like, well, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to show everybody this. We also start seeing the use of power and control. As with most abusive relationships, power and control really lies in the center. So if you're not familiar with the power and control wheel, you can look that up. It's a pretty easy resource. Sexual assault has one, domestic violence has one, and human trafficking also has one. So you see all those tactics of isolation, emotional abuse, physical abuse, using things like privilege over an individual to really get them to do what you want. From recruitment, you go over to initiation. So at recruitment, usually it's where you started pushing those boundaries and maybe getting that young person to start engaging in activities that aren't completely comfortable. And when you move over to the initiation, it's really getting them to fully engage in that exploitation. And you might do that through exposure of extreme amount of psychological stress, normalizing the exploitation. So it's also that piece around manipulating, like, don't be embarrassed about what you're doing. There's so many girls out there that are doing the same thing and they don't even get paid for it. You're just being smart about yours. You're just, doing, making the most with what you have. So really normalizing and trying to almost get that youth to feel powerful and feel like this is a choice that they're making on their own. From initiation, we move over to indoctrination, and that's creating the dependency on the authority of the trafficker, trauma bonding, and reinforcing the sense of otherness. So I really like that it really speaks to creating the dependency on the authority. So it's not just the dependency on the trafficker for money or for things, but it's on the authority. So feeling that this exploiter is really the person that's going to guide them, and is going to be able to tell them what's best for them. Trauma bonding, so things like Stockholm Syndrome really come into play here. And I like to point out that things like trauma bonding, they're not just psychological. Some of those are also just kind of physiological reactions that we have. And trauma bonding really happens as a defense mechanism. We trauma bond to keep safe. Usually when we feel that our safety is completely tied to another person, or our ability to survive is tied to another person, we bond in order to be able to survive. So another piece that, if you're not familiar with, I think is really good to read on, because one of the things that I saw came up was like, what do we do when young people don't want to leave the exploiter? And understanding some of these things like trauma bonds, I think, can be really powerful and helpful in understanding how those dynamics come about. Reinforcing the sense of otherness. So using terms like the life to create a community within the exploitation, and using things like calling anybody who's not part of exploitation squares, right? They're part of the square world. And it really creates this otherness, both, and it does two things, right? For the young person, it makes them feel like they're a part of the community, and they're a part of something. But then it also creates a separation to where if they feel they ever want to go back to regular society, they're no longer able to. So it really works on double sides there. So another thing that comes up for young people when we are looking at the process of exploitation is that for us, it can feel really obvious as to who is the victim, who the perpetrator is, who the bystanders are, and who the rescuers are. Usually the rescuer is, maybe the police officer or the social worker that's trying to support this young person. But since we don't know a victim's or a survivor's full story, we have to keep in mind that those roles aren't always as clean and cut as we think they are. So if, say, that young person was being sexually assaulted at home or in their foster home, and then you have an exploiter that comes in and is like, hey, you can come stay with me. Yeah, you're gonna have to do some work if you're staying with me, but it's no different than what you were doing before, and now you have a choice, and now you can make some money. So rather than seeing that exploiter as the perpetrator, that victim might see that exploiter as a rescuer, right? They got them out of this really terrible situation that they didn't want to be in. And yes, they're still being exploited, but they're maybe getting some needs met that weren't being met before. So then now that they see this exploiter as a rescuer, and then say a police officer comes in, or they're going to school and a teacher reports that they're being exploited, now that teacher or that other person that intervened might be the perpetrator, right? Because now they're going to get taken back maybe to that foster home where the abuse was happening, or they're going to get sent back home where they have a very volatile or unhealthy relationship at home. So those trauma roles can really get skewed and can get really switched around depending on where that young person is, their relationship with their exploiter, and as well as what their relationships have been with other systems. So whether that's family system, whether that's the foster care system, juvenile care system, all those pieces can really get switched around for young people. And it's really important to remember that, because sometimes we feel offended or we get hurt that this young person doesn't want our support, but we don't know what role we're playing for them. So being able and being willing to take that step back. I always tell people, if you are not ready to get cussed out by a young person, you may want to consider another role, because young people get upset and they have feelings, and we have to be ready and in a position to navigate those with them. So as these trauma roles get warped around, we sometimes start hearing some of these things, right? Where a young person isn't identifying as being a victim. So they may say things like, well, I give it away for free, or they're my family, like they wouldn't hurt me. This is just what we do to get by. Maybe my exploiters helped me more than anyone else ever has. Or it makes me feel powerful. Right? And that can also just be the young person trying to gain some power from a situation in which they're completely powerless, and really trying to almost make the best out of a really terrible situation. So how do young people find their way in? Again, it's a lot through relationship buildings, but these are some of the more common relationships that tend to come up. So seduction recruitment, Romeo exploitation. This is the most common for sex trafficking as a whole, from young people to those above 18. And that's somebody who comes in and builds and establishes a romantic relationship with the young person, and then through that romantic relationship manipulates the young person into exploitation. So that young person may still be getting love and affection and feeling like they're part of this family and group, but they are being exploited to kind of get these things out of that. Familial exploitation, that one is the one that we see the youngest children get exploited through. So usually if somebody's being exploited but by their family, the exploitation starts anywhere between 4 and 10 years old. And that can be any family member or caregiver. So it doesn't have to, it could be, an adoptive parent, foster parent, and somebody that they're staying with. That's a family member, that all those apply in familial exploitation. Mom, uncle, sibling. So those are usually the youngest age of entry. And that we often see as using things like guilt and manipulating the idea of like, well, I'm your parent, you have to listen, or I've taken care of you for all these years, now you have to also take on. It could also be a piece of like maybe it's something that the parent did, and maybe it's something that's being continued and passed on as this is what our family does. And I think that also creates this gray area for young people where it's like, well, if my mom did it or my aunt does it, then it can't be that bad, because this is how they've taken care of me. And they're not a bad person, so this isn't a bad thing to do, right? So it can also create those gray areas for people. Peer recruitment. Peer recruitment is what we see the most with young people. So like I said, seduction recruitment is the biggest overall for sex trafficking, but with youth under 18, peer recruitment is the main form of recruitment. And generally your peer recruiter is what is called the bottom girl or the bottom bitch, and she is the exploiter's main youth that's being exploited. So whether that's because she's been with the exploiter the longest or because she pulls in the most money, they're all part of that title also means that they're the person that brings other young people in. So one of the reasons we believe we see this the most is because relationships maybe have already been established, because they could have already been friends. There's also a vulnerability in having somebody who looks like you and maybe shares really similar identities as you, telling you, to try something out and not to worry about it and that it's really easy. It often starts off with like, hey, why don't you just come with me tonight? You don't have to do anything. I just don't like I don't want to go to the state by myself. If you come with me, we can go have lunch afterwards. Or if you hang out with me, we can get our nails done. I just got to go to a date. And what they do is often making it seem really easy. I'm not really speaking about any of the negative aspects to it. Another important thing to keep in mind in peer recruitment, is that that young person who is the recruiter might genuinely also think that they're helping out. So if maybe they were in a very similar position that a friend is, and maybe they're not seeing a lot of violence, or maybe for them it feels like a better position, they might tell them like, no, you know, this is a genuinely me trying to help you. But it's also important to remember that the recruiter is expected to recruit, and there are definitely situations where if they're not recruiting, they can experience violence or different forms of abuse. So, you know, that peer recruiter falls into this gray area where sometimes people also see them as an exploiter. But it's really important to remember that even though they may be engaging in some activities that play the role of an exploiter, they are themselves being exploited as well. So they also should be treated as an exploited youth and be seen as an exploited youth. Guerrilla exploitation is what I think most people think of when they think of trafficking. It's that very I want to say it's what most movies usually use as what they showcase, but it's that kidnapping, rape, using drugs, taking youth from off the street. But it is one of the ones that is least comes up for young people, but it does exist. So it's really important to make sure that young people are aware of their surroundings, are aware of anything that could be happening around them that doesn't quite feel right. Something that is coming up with guerrilla exploitation is using social media to lure young people in. So doing things like catfishing. And catfishing is pretending to be somebody online that you're really not. So maybe they'll pretend to be a young person that's interested, or maybe romantically interested, or maybe trying to befriend the young person. And they kind of build a relationship and establish trust, and then, you know, ask to meet that young person. And usually we might see somebody say like, yeah, you know, I'm having a party, or why don't we go out sometime, meet me at the park. And then when this young person goes out, they realize that it's not at all who they thought it was. And then that kidnapping and force takes place. So poverty and survival sex. Again, this is definitely something that we see a lot, and this is one of the ones that's really hard for young people to identify as exploitation. So being given food or shelter or other basic needs to engage in the commercial sexual exploitation. And, you know, sometimes young people feel like they, you know, it's like, well, if I didn't do this, I would have nowhere to stay, or they're just being really nice, and maybe they're attracted to me in this being really nice. Not realizing that it's, you know, it's been exploitation, and that's how it's been set up from the beginning. Recruitment by coercion. So an exploiter will use intimidation, threats, blackmail, or some other pressure to get that person to violate their own values. CEO pimping, or recruitment by fraud. This one really shows up in different ways for young people. I think depending on where you're at. So maybe in like larger metropolitan areas, you might see somebody saying like, you know, you can be a model or an acting agent. And oftentimes these exploiters may be agents. So they may get a young person some modeling gigs, or they may, you know, get the young person some work. But it's only like the surface piece to then exploit that young person. So it can show up in a lot of different ways. It can, you know, be from setting a young person up to think that they're going to a photo shoot, but they're actually, you know, going and they get exploited and they get raped in a space. Or it can be by getting that young person to like push those boundaries. So maybe their young person shows up for a photo shoot and they're like, well, you know, what if you take your top off? Or what if you take your underwear off? Or, you know, if you really want to make it in this field, you have to be willing to do some of these things. So really kind of using those pieces to get that young person to push those boundaries. It could also be to get that, you know, telling that young person like, oh, you know, I got you a gig in New York. And the young person's like, I have no way of getting there. And they're like, well, you know, some of my other girls go on dates to raise money for things like that. Or I'll fly you to New York, but you got to go on a date with somebody when you get there. And, you know, putting this person's dreams and aspirations on one end and feeling like, well, you know, it's just one date. So that can really happen. It can also be, you know, telling somebody just that they can help them travel, or they can help them, you know, go different places or get different things, and all they have to do is be an escort. You know, they just got to go to dinner with somebody, but then how that escalates, and then that can always moves into more. And then gang-based exploitation is a gang forces a young person into exploitation as a means of getting initiated to the gang, or as a means of financially supporting the gang. So it's definitely the initiation piece, but then that opens the door after the initiation to continue that exploitation. The other piece on gang-based exploitation can also be as like a safety piece, where if the gang will exploit a young person in exchange for not harming that young person or keeping that young person's family safe within a community, right, to avoid any harm for that individual. So those are the recruitment tactics, the pathways we see the most. It does not mean that those are the only ones that exist, and you know, they definitely can overlap. So somebody can start as the seduction Romeo recruiter and then move into the guerrilla recruiter. Or things can start as survival sex and then move into the Romeo exploitation. So they can overlap, and they do switch over between one and the other. So how do we identify when our young people are kind of going through that pathway, whether it's the grooming stage or whether they've been recruited and are engaging? Things like unexplained bruises or injuries, using terms like the life, the blade, or the track, referring to someone that is not their father as daddy, particularly if they're older, evidence of a controlling or dominating relationship. They have new or expensive items without knowing means to get them. So this can include clothing. It could include all of a sudden coming in with their nails done or having their hair done all the time. Unaccounted periods of time, truancy or inability to maintain a school schedule, right? It's really hard to show up in the mornings for school or be active and awake when you've been forced to be out all night. Change in behaviors, so any new fears, any hypervigilance or depression, any radical changes in appearance. Not in control of their own money or identification documents, or any tattoo on their neck, chest, or arms that could be the result of branding by an exploiter. So oftentimes it could be the exploiter's name, maybe it's the crew of exploiters that are running together, that whatever they call themselves. We also see barcodes, literally putting, you know, young people in barcodes and making them a product. Can also show up. It's often like on the neck, in the back of the neck, on the arms. Now, all these are red flags. None of them are for sure things that tell us that a young person is being exploited. So it's really important to, if these things start coming up, we can start engaging and maybe having conversations, but we cannot assume that that young person is having this experience because of these red flags or identifying pieces. But they can definitely guide us to, you know, at least having a conversation and seeing what is going on with that young person. All right, so serving and supporting young people. So if, you know, these things are showing up for our young people, or maybe there are other things that are concerning and we are wondering how do we engage with them. First and foremost, just addressing our language. So when we are talking about young people who are being exploited, referring to them as such. So whether they're CSEC, whether they're a sex trafficked youth, they are never a teen prostitute. They are never a child prostitute. It was not a child prostitution ring. It was exploited children. When we speak to prostitute, we really are speaking to choice. And young people, again, by law and by common knowledge, are not choosing this. They cannot give consent for this type of activity. So when we change the language, it really helps us reframe the issue as a form of abuse. It unpacks the notion of choice. It more accurately represents the scope of the issue rather than defining an exploited youth by their experience. And it creates a common language, which facilitates moving toward an effective community response. So that way, if it's a teacher who's letting somebody know that this young person is being exploited, that other person, that maybe it's a social worker, maybe it's a school counselor, can now know what resources would be appropriate for that young person, right? So creating this common language allows us to really be able to access resource for young people. And, you know, whether we want to or not, the word prostitute has a negative connotation attached to it. And so when we start using that word to speak to a young person that's being exploited, you're also attaching any negative connotation that that word has. And maybe it doesn't pack any negativity for you, but it does, as it says, in the society and community have that, and we do not want to attach that to our young people. We also don't want young people to think that they are making choice, right? If we start saying that they are prostitutes, teen prostitutes, child prostitutes, it starts, you know, telling them that this is a choice piece. We want to make sure that we are, you know, unpacking that notion for them. So along with the language of talking about CSEC youth, we also want to just overall look at what language we use when we're working with young people. So, you know, do we feel that we work with young people who are disrespectful or manipulative, or they're unwilling to change? But what happens when, rather than look at young people as problems, we look at them as opportunity, rather than them being defiant? Maybe they're just neglected. Maybe they're not unreasonable. Maybe they just don't trust people. And remembering that a lot of the behaviors that are on the left could be survival tactics for young people, right? If you are being forced to day after day engage in exploitation, which means day after day you're being forced to engage in sexual abuse, you better know how to manipulate situations to keep yourself safe. Or you better have, you know, some argumentative pieces to keep yourself safe. So just remembering that some of these things we see are how young people are being able to survive out in the world. And we're telling them to put all those guards down, to put all those skill sets down, and just be what we want them to be and be what is comfortable for us. So really, you know, changing those, changing that language, not only in how we view our young people, but also in how we talk about them. So, you know, if you're sending a referral over, or if somebody's client comes in and you're like, oh, you know, here comes your trouble, you know, or here comes that trouble client, you know, what stage are we setting up for that young person? You know, how much help are we actually going to be able to give them from that point of view? So bad language leads to bad perspective, which ultimately leads us to bad practice. So again, words are really powerful. So really using their power in a positive way and changing that perspective. Now, by no means does it mean that we're not allowed to have feelings, right? If a young person just yelled at us or just told us something negative, we're allowed to feel things. But being able to move past that and still show up for that young person and still be able to kind of keep that positive regard to them. Also addressing power dynamics. There is nothing wrong with power. Power is not a dirty word. But it is important that we are able to look at it and have an idea of power dynamics. So whenever a young person is coming to us for support, or when we're looking to support a young person, we have power over. And there's a lot of reasons for that, whether it's because we're an authority figure, maybe we have power because of age and experience. But it's important that when we're working with them, we don't exploit that power. We don't manipulate or influence that young person's choice with that power we hold. And we can do this by, you know, maybe a young person is looking at 3 different career choices, and there's one of those that we really don't like. So we only present 2. Or we really talk positively about 2, but the 3rd one, we're just kind of like, I'm not really going to tell them much about it. I'm just going to show them the paperwork. So that's a way of manipulating it, right? That's a way of manipulating to what you think is best for that young person, rather than giving that person full transparency and letting them decide for themselves. We really want to work with having power with our young people. So working through compassion, facilitating pieces for them, building community, and collaborating. In doing that, we hope to have young people find that power within. So then they can move forward with integrity and purpose, really build out their capacity, and have full presence in their lives. Young people are already experiencing having power over, right? Exploitation is already somebody having power over them. We can't tell young people that they are deserving of more or that there are healthier relationships than that when we aren't performing in that way. So the best way to show young people what a healthy relationship is by being the example of that. And so when young people find that, so when we're working with people and hoping that they find empowerment, it's important that we know what empowerment means. This word gets used a lot, empowerment models, but what does that really mean? It's really autonomy and self-determination. So we can't empower young people because empowerment comes from within. So anytime we're working from giving advice or rescuing or letting young people know that you're the expert, imposing your agenda and values on young people, or not being willing to admit fault, we are not empowering young people. Really allowing that young person to act on their own authority, even if it's not the choice we hope for them, even if it's not what we agree, really allowing them to do that, collaborating with them, asking young people for permission, whether that's sharing information, whether that's moving forward on support services, making sure that young person is in agreement with what we're doing, following their lead and supporting them unconditionally no matter what mistakes they make. We all make mistakes, right? But somehow with children and young people, we have a lot less room for them to do so, right? They're not allowed to have meltdowns. They're not allowed to be angry. They aren't allowed to try things and find out that those things don't quite work. So remembering that that's a very human part. And yes, they're young, but that's how we learn. So youth empowerment really focuses on non-judgmental and being person-centered, having a consistent environment and positive reinforcement. Again, there's a lot of instability in young people's lives, so making sure that we are a consistent, stable space for that young person, a trauma-informed model of care, unconditional positive regard, and improve systemic collaboration and response. So unconditional positive regard just really speaks to, again, if that young person yells at you and cusses you out and tells you all about yourself, being able to the next day when that young person shows up, have a positive regard with them to say, hey, how's it going? Not holding on to what happened yesterday or what happened earlier, just being able to move through that with that young person. And it doesn't mean that we don't address those things, but it means we don't hold those things against that young person. So why a victim may not ask for help, a lot of, only 1/3 of victims identify, another third do not identify as being trafficking victims. Survivors also may not have the language, so some of them do identify as something is happening but don't know quite what to call it. A young person may feel angry and let down by adults in society. All those systems, family, foster care, health systems that were supposed to help them have not. They've actually maybe been areas where they've seen exploitation or where they've seen abuse. So they may be really just angry. And they may refuse help because there aren't real viable options available. And it can also be a safety piece, right? Exploiters can be violent and can be dangerous. And it's important that when our young people are telling us it's not safe, that we listen to them. And also, if we tell them, like, leave this, what is their pathway out of it? Is there safety? Is there a way for them to be sustainable long-term as far as financial support, educational support, community support? So making sure that we're really looking at those viable options with them. A lot of reasons why victims don't report, from shame or guilt, to trauma bonding with traffickers or other victims, isolation, feeling complicit in illegal acts, and distrust of police or the providers. We follow a stages of change module to support our young people. Definitely something to look into if you're not familiar with it. But just remembering change is really difficult. You know, I'm sure we've all had our New Year's resolutions or are, you know, deciding to quit something or stop a behavior that maybe isn't the healthiest or doesn't align with our values. And we probably didn't get it right the first time. So just remembering that change is a process. It's hard, and that it takes a lot of support and usually more than one try. So no matter where a young person is, showing positive regard, being non-judgmental, validating and normalizing feelings, and understanding that it's a slow cycle and long-term work. Trauma-informed care, we have a trauma-informed care lens, and we approach our work towards helping youth find themselves out of trauma and moving into a healthier space. It's really moving away from what is wrong with you to what happened to you, but also remembering that the young person isn't only a victim or survivor. They're a whole individual. So really addressing them as a whole person, not just based on their trauma. Well, thank you all. And I think we are right at 10:50. So I think we're going to be answering some questions for the next 10 minutes or so.
Yes, perfect. That was great. Thank you so much. So we do have a handful of questions. The first one is, how do you recommend we find preventative tools and resources in the area that we live and teach?
So there are definitely some models. So like there's Word on the Street by Nola Brantley, and they do trainings. So if there's not already something being available, working from that you can get training on that. But I would also say, like, since a lot of recruitment happens within relationships, even looking for something that speaks to healthy relationships, or addresses a sexual assault, so things like consent and boundaries, I think are really good ways to build tools for young people to have prevention.
Perfect, thank you. Do you have any information about resources for trans identified victims of trafficking?
I want to say yes, but that's also going to depend what area they're in. So it's gonna vary. So for example, I mean, we're a resource, you know, we do serve girls, but that's anyone that identifies. So that's like a full spectrum. And I think most organizations are within that range as well. They serve anybody who identifies.
Perfect, thank you. What government departments are helping with these exploited youth and children?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you're looking at it. I think since 2000, when the Trafficking Victims Prevention Act came into play, I think everybody has started to slowly create movement, right, from requiring police officers to receive training around human trafficking. For example, here in Oakland, over the past couple years, we've been engaging with all Oakland City workers in training them on CSEC 101, from librarians to park workers to firefighters. So it's going to vary in the different areas, but there are definitely legislations out there that are requiring it to be part of trainings and education. And then there's definitely federal funding that comes into play. I know that there are that different entities work with really looking at when trafficking is going from state to state and crossing borders, and being able to bring that to federal courts, because the federal courts have stronger laws against trafficking than individual states. So I definitely know that there's groups working on that end as well. So I think almost everybody is starting to, at the very least, beginning to start supporting movements around trafficking.
Perfect, thank you. The next question says, with the takedown of Backpage, what other technology apps are you seeing utilized for recruitment?
Oh man, almost everything. So social media is a big one, both because I think young people are really actively engaging in there, and it's so easy to create accounts and erase them and not have kind of like a paper trail. So things like Instagram, like I had mentioned, Snapchat. There's a Snapchat premium that you pay to see people's pictures, much like Snapchat, but you actually have to pay. So that's like a big one that gets used. Webcam, like the chat rooms, the live cam chat rooms get used a lot. But I mean, it's such a big space that I'd say that you'd almost find it anywhere. You'd find the recruitment happening just about everywhere.
Thank you. Can you recommend any resources to provide directly to youth to educate them on this topic?
It's a tricky question. I would say if they're youth that are, if we're looking at a preventative lens, again, I would say looking at some of the models that are already out there. There's, like I said, there's Word on the Street, intervention. There's a program called Ending the Game. So these are trainings that people can sign up for. I know that they do in live and some online trainings to really try to do that. But, you know, like here in the Bay Area, we go out and we do prevention trainings. So it's also, I'd say, looking to see if anybody in your area is doing any type of prevention work. But again, anytime we're coming back and talking to young people about boundaries and consent and just, you know, identifying healthy relationships within ourselves and family members and romance relationships, I think we're starting to build that groundwork to help youth have those tools.
Perfect, thank you. And the last question says, what does the community need to do or assist with stopping this epidemic?
I think we need to create space. I think we need to create space for young people to be able to safely have conversations about what's going on from their experiences and relationships to once they're seeing exploitation and not feel that they're going to see judgment, as well as create space to have resources for young people, right? Once we know somebody's being exploited, rather than create a whole bunch of questions of like, well, what happened and what's going on? It should really be a statement that opens up doors, right? Oh, that young person's being exploited. What do you need? Right? And just a plethora of resources would show up for that young person. I think it's also holding our communities accountable. You know, yes, we have really strong laws against exploiters, and it's really important that we address that, but also addressing the fact that we have no laws, or we have very weak laws towards buyers, right? How do we hold our community accountable that is buying our young people, right? At the end, this is a business. And so that demand is definitely a huge problem as to why we have this supply. So holding our community members accountable on all ends, and really creating support systems, and then addressing those, you know, those pieces that lead to the risk factors. So things like poverty, right? Moving towards spaces that have equal pay, that create opportunities where education is equal across the board, not just in some areas, where resources are accessible for our young people, not just some people. So really looking at that equity lens, addressing human trafficking is, I think, addressing larger social issues that exist, and really working from there, and how those create the risk factors for young people to then be exploited.
Perfect, thank you. And I know we're down to the wire, but we did get a live question. There's actually two of them. Do you still feel that it's possible to help the youth recover even if they never identify as being exploited?
Yes, I think that, you know, young people can have tools to start navigating the world in a healthier way. We work from a harm reduction lens. So our view is never about having a young person completely stop or leave the life, or, we are no one to tell a young person what to do or what is best for them, but we can definitely operate from a space to make that young person's life healthier and safer. And that's healthier from a physical to an emotional and psychological space. So helping that young person find the tools that they need to find healthier spaces for themselves. And then also some young people just may not identify because they don't want, there are stigmas associated with some of these titles. So from victim to survivor, there's stigmas that are associated with those titles, with those words. So some young people may not identify it just because they don't want to add another label to themselves. They may already have a few attached and they don't want another one, but it doesn't mean that they're not looking for support, and it doesn't mean that they're not looking for betterment in their life.
Perfect, thank you. And lastly, can you tell us about the referral process for MISSSEY and if there's a wait time?
So the referral process is we have a referral form online, and you can fill it out online and email it in, or you can email it over. Just send us an email, let us know what that young person needs. We do also have our drop-in center. Our drop-in center is open Monday through Friday from 1 to 6. At the time, and those hours sometimes change, but for the most part it's from 1 to 6 Monday through Friday, and young people are welcome to just drop in, so that once they get here we can kind of go through with them and tell them a little bit about the space. While we serve young people ages 12 to 24, our drop-in center, we usually recommend ages 14 to 24, just because when the 12, 13-year-olds come in, there can be quite an age gap when we have like the 20 plus group in there. But if somebody is 12, 13 and they want to come to the drop-in center, they can definitely come in and we can then connect them with the case manager at that point. But any questions you can always call. We also do we're also happy to come out and meet that young person wherever they're at. So we are based in Oakland, but we can go out about 50-mile radius to serve young people.
Amazing, thank you. I want to thank you, Andrea, so much for your time and information, and thank our participants for joining us. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be archived on our website and will be available shortly. And for those of you who are participating, you will be automatically taken to an evaluation when this ends. We would love for you to fill it out and share any feedback that you have, and you will also be given an additional opportunity to enter to win a free book. So we will be in touch, and thank you all for joining.